gathering. Okay, the topic today that we are going to cover is acute flaccid paralysis, and we have kept the title as Facing the Fallacies and Understanding the Syndrome. As we go along, you will possibly realize that why we have kept the title like this. But before we jump towards acute flaccid paralysis, we'll talk a little bit about neuroanatomy. And this is how most of the impulses, most of the motor cortex controls us. So it's the corticospinal tract. They start from the motor cortex, they descend in the internal capsule. Thereafter, they descend in the midbrain, down to pons, medulla, where they decussate. And finally, they end in the spinal cord. So it's everything till the ending of the corticospinal tract, that is above the anterior horn cell, is what constitutes the upper motor neuron. And quickly to go through what are the features which suggest upper motor neuron lesion are, if the lesion is in cortex, we usually say that the child should be having some amount of altered sensorium or seizures. If the involvement is in internal capsule, maybe they'll end up having a dense hemiplegia with or without facial nerve involvement. So there's corticospinal and possibly a corticobulbar involvement.
Dr. Vishal, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you switch on your video? It will be good.
Okay, I'll do that. So give me a minute. I'll switch it on.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, am I visible now?
Yes, Dr. Vishal, thank you.
Okay, at the level of midbrain, pons, medulla, if we usually localize it to the brainstem based on the involvement of the cranial nerves. So all this is what highlights the upper motor neuron kind of a lesion. While everything, as we said, everything above the level of anterior horn cell is the upper motor neuron, and starting from anterior horn cell down to the nerve, to the peripheral nerve, nerve root, to the peripheral nerve, to the neuromuscular and the muscle fiber is what constitutes the lower motor neuron. We'll go through the symptomatology and the clinical features of these as we go along. And now coming back, and some of the features we have already laid down over here, that if there's involvement of the anterior horn cells, there will be prominent atrophy, hypotonia, power will be reduced to absent, there'll be areflexia. Similarly, if the lesion is at the level of nerves, there will be atrophy or hypotonia, ascending or at times even descending paralysis, and areflexia. At the level of NMJ, neuromuscle junction, there will be easy fatigability, diplopia, ptosis, but the reflexes will be preserved. And if the lesion is at the level of muscles, it is usually a proximal weakness, may have tenderness depending upon if it's an inflammatory disease, and they may have hyporeflexia. Now, as we said in the title, that it is, we'll try to learn about acute flaccid paralysis in this talk on the basis of the fallacies that we as a unit have committed over the past some years. So I'll just run through some of the fallacies which have been in the medical practice for some time and which have been proven wrong over the years. One of the first one is, which is like age old, that most of the diseases in our body is caused by imbalance of the bodily humors. That earlier there used to be, it used to be said that there are 4 bodily humors and everything is in balance, and the moment the balance is disrupted, the disease is caused. Over the years, we have seen science has proven this wrong. At least when we were postgraduate students, we were taught that if a patient is hypotensive, start him on a renal dose of dopamine. Over the years, again, it has been proven that there's nothing like a renal dose of dopamine. Then came the concept that if we maintain a tight glycemic control, that is, we maintain HbA1c less than 6%, it is associated with low cardiovascular mortality. Again, it has been proven that it's not the case. And another fallacy that we often come across, at least in our practices, that every case of acute flaccid paralysis ends up getting labeled as Guillain-Barré syndrome. Again, as we go along the talk, you'll realize that it is not always the case. So this was a child who presented to us, I think a couple of years back. He was son of a colleague. He is son of a colleague. He came back from the school, complained of general unease, said some pain in the calf. On waking up in the evening, he slept off in the afternoon, he woke up in the evening, and the mother found that he was not able to bear weight on both the lower limbs. Next morning, he was unable to move either of the two limbs. And by next evening, when he was brought to us, he had complete respiratory paralysis. So at that point of time, when we carried out the examination, we found that the child was conscious. He was able to communicate by his eyelids, by vocalization, but the bulk was normal, but there was complete hypotonia. He was not able to move any of the limbs, and he had areflexia. Now, we usually, all the neurologists in their mind, every time they see a case, they run it in their heads that, is it an upper motor neuron lesion? Does the kid have any of the UMN symptoms localizing to cortex, internal capsule, brainstem, the ones we spoke of initially? Or does he have any of the LMN lesions localizing to anterior horn cell, root, peripheral nerves, NMJ, muscles? Again, we spoke of some of these at the beginning. So this kid was conscious, did not have any seizures. There were no cranial nerve palsies. So possibly cortex, internal capsule, brainstem were intact. He had he had complete loss of power, he had hypotonia, and he had areflexia. So possibly the lesion was not an NMJ. It was unlikely to be in the muscles. It was possibly localizing to anterior horn cell or to the peripheral nerve. So he was labeled as the case of Guillain-Barré syndrome, and the management was started. Now, what is Guillain-Barré syndrome? We often come across this term. We'll start with this graph, which appeared in Lancet about 3 or 4 years back. So Guillain-Barré syndrome is characterized initially by some infection, possibly a viral infection, but at times it can be a bacterial infection also. The common infections which have been implicated include influenza, Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, chikungunya, bacterial infections such as Campylobacter, H. influenza, Mycoplasma, and even at times vaccination, especially with influenza, measles, rubella, and rabies. After this infection, which may be a clinical or a subclinical infection following vaccination, the body produces antibodies. The antibodies are mainly produced against the infection, but there is epitope sharing, there's molecular mimicry, as a result of which these antibodies cross-react with the gangliosides. Depending upon the ganglioside which gets damaged because of these antibodies, different types of GBS or Guillain-Barré syndrome take place. So this leads to a peak in damage to the gangliosides, which is followed by the clinical features in which initially there is worsening of the clinical features, and thereafter there is a plateau phase in which the clinical features get plateaued, and then depending upon how much of damage has taken place over the several next months or years, the recovery takes place. Now, the clinical features of GBS, we usually end up thinking of GBS as a completely motor syndrome, but almost about half or 8 out of 10 patients end up starting with pain. The pain may be in the form of back pain or in the form of a muscle ache, or it may be in the form of paresthesias, or there have been scenarios where we have ended up labeling a patient as meningitis because there was severe neck rigidity. So pain is one of the most specific features, or one of the commoner features of GBS, and it usually precedes the onset of muscle weakness in about 1/3 of the patients. Thereafter is the clinical features which we commonly see. So there is a low motor neuron kind of a weakness. And whenever we see a low motor neuron kind or any weakness, we classify the motor system into bulk, tone, power, and reflexes. So bulk is usually preserved in these patients. Tone is reduced, so there is flaccidity. Power is reduced, so there is symmetrical ascending paralysis. In the initial 1 or for the first day or for the first 2 days, the weakness may be relatively asymmetrical. That is, it may be more in one limb as compared to the other limb. But thereafter, the weakness is more or less symmetrical. It is ascending. It starts in the distal lower limbs and it ascends upwards toward the proximal part from the lower limbs to the trunk to the upper limbs to the cervical cord, leading to the involvement of diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. And if it ascends any further, it will lead to the involvement of the cranial nerves. The deep tendon reflexes can initially be normal, but subsequently, all these patients end up having areflexia. The other clinical features which are there, respiratory insufficiency, if there's involvement of the truncal level of spinal cord, then it will lead to intercostal weakness. If it ascends to the cervical cord, it leads to the weakness of the diaphragm. So there will be respiratory insufficiency. Now, the common notion is that every patient who has respiratory insufficiency will have respiratory distress. Now, these patients are having a neuromuscular weakness, so they don't have respiratory distress. So there will be no use of accessory muscles of respiration. Rather, they will keep on having lesser and lesser work of breathing, as a result of which they will keep on going into hypoxia. One of the best ways to check respiratory insufficiency in these patients is by checking the weakness of the diaphragmatic muscles, by checking the weakness of the intercostal muscles, and by doing a single breath count for these patients. If it ascends any further, then it will lead to the weakness of the cranial nerves, which may manifest in the form of facial weakness. If it involves the 9th and 10th nerve, it will lead to swallowing difficulties. And in some scenarios, especially, there are certain variants, especially the Miller-Fisher variant, where it may lead to the involvement of extraocular muscles, leading to ophthalmoplegia. And apart from, so there is involvement of the sensory system, the motor system, and there is also autonomic dysfunction, which is usually one of the first things which happen in these patients. And the autonomic dysfunction, it usually presents in the form of instability of the blood pressure. They may present in the form of excessive sweating because of arrhythmia, paralytic ileus, or bladder incontinence. And a lot of times when these patients present, by the time they present to the hospital, they usually end up having one of these autonomic dysfunctions. So if you see so far, we did not do any investigation. We just went through the symptomatology of the patient. And just on the basis of symptomatology, one can conclude that, okay, this patient possibly has Guillain-Barré syndrome. So it's a clinical diagnosis. Now comes, because it's a clinical diagnosis and because there are so many other things which look like it, arises this confusion. So all cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome are acute flaccid paralysis. But unlike a mathematical equation, the reverse is not true. All cases of acute flaccid paralysis are not Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now, just to expand on the term acute flaccid paralysis, we will go through how this term originated and what does it mean. So if we have to understand the syndrome of acute flaccid paralysis, and if we break it down into its 3 components. So acute means if the disease has progressed over 4 weeks. Flaccid means that the tone is not increased. The tone is decreased. So the child is floppy, the child is hypotonic. And paralysis means that the child has weakness of the limbs. So if I have to say it in a single sentence, acute flaccid paralysis is a limb paralysis affecting limbs and progressing over less than 4 weeks duration is acute flaccid paralysis. Now this is important because most of the times we end up seeing a UMN kind of a weakness where the tone is increased. So instead of having flaccidity, those kids, the UMN lesion kids, end up having a spasticity or hypertonia. Now this acute flaccid paralysis term was coined way back in 1980s. Now this was the time when polio was quite rampant even in North America, and the North American organization, which was called as the Pan American Health Organization, they adopted this term of acute flaccid paralysis. And the reason was they wanted to consider every case of acute flaccid paralysis as polio. And they said that every case of acute flaccid paralysis, we consider it as polio. We will immunize everyone around him, and we will just go ahead and try to eradicate every case of acute flaccid paralysis. Later on, the success of this program was so much that the same program was adopted by WHO. And the basis of eradication of polio was kept as that there should be a high vaccination coverage for polio. There should be a surveillance system for timely detection of the patients with paralytic illness. And there should be surveillance of wild polio virus in community. Now, the acute flaccid paralysis looks after this surveillance system. So all patients of acute flaccid paralysis were considered as polio in 80s and 90s unless proven otherwise. Over the years, polio started getting eradicated from most of the countries, and then came the idea that the surveillance system should be such that we should be able to pick up one case of acute flaccid paralysis per 100,000 children up to the age of 15 years. Now this term of, or this surveillance of 1 per 100,000 came from the prevalence of, or from the incidence of Guillain-Barré syndrome. We have one case of Guillain-Barré syndrome plus 100,000 children. So that's why the surveillance system was developed. And there arose the first fallacy that we started thinking that every case of AFP is a case of Guillain-Barré syndrome. We go on to the second case. Just keep the first case in your mind, whom we said that he's possibly a case of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now we go on to the second case. This was an 11-year-old boy who came, one second, I'll just, I will just, yeah. So this is an 11-year-old boy who came to us with the complaint that while he was playing, he had a discomfort in right leg. He came back home. In the evening, the parents found that he's moving the right leg less as compared to the left one. And he was not able to tell about passing of urine. Now he's an 11-year-old boy who was going to school. He comes back and he's moving one leg less than rest of the limbs. The parents thought that maybe he's got hurt somewhere. He slept off. Next morning he got up. He was not able to move either of the two limbs, both the lower limbs. Over the next 12 hours, he was not moving the right upper limb also. So it was at this time that he was brought to the hospital, and when examined, we found that he has severe backache. He was not allowing any movement of the neck. There was flaccidity of all the 4 limbs. The power was grade 3 in left upper limb, and it was around grade 1 in grade 0 to 1 in all other limbs. He had areflexia of all the 4 limbs, and he was not cooperative for the sensory examination. So the child had onset in less than 4 weeks. There was hypotonia in all the 4 limbs. There is paralysis. So he fitted into the definition of acute flaccid paralysis. The team thought that it is a case of GBS. He's having flaccidity. In the beginning, they may have asymmetry to start off. So he was started on IVIG. He was reevaluated the next morning, and we found that the power in the right upper limb was still grade 3, and it was around grade 1 in all other limbs. So there was persistent asymmetry. Further general examination revealed that he had a cranial scar, which was suggestive of an earlier surgery. And when inquired, the parents said that yes, he had undergone a surgery for an intracranial bleed when he was 6 months old. So there were certain caveats over here which was suggesting that possibly this child may not be GBS. One of them was he had bladder involvement right at the onset. When he had presented back at home itself, he was not able to tell about bladder fullness. And the second was that the weakness was asymmetric, and it continued to be asymmetric. In our own head, we usually say that we keep on reevaluating the motor system, And if the asymmetry persists beyond 2 examinations, carried out about 6 to 8 hours apart, then we say that, oh, this is persistent asymmetry and there's something else, there's something wrong with this child. So there were these two things which were pointing that possibly we are not dealing with GBS. So we performed a cranial MRI for this child, and we found that there was this huge lesion in the cervical cord over here and over here, as well as, so everything from around C2, C3 level down till the dorsal, about D2, D3 level was involved. There was a bleeding at the level of about C4 to C5, and there was edema all around it. So and over here, if you see there is involvement, there's old bleed which has taken place in the cerebellum also. So this is possibly a case of spinal AV malformation who bled in the cervical spinal cord, who had manifested with features suggestive of acute flaccid paralysis, but persistent asymmetry and involvement of urinary bladder right at the beginning suggested that possibly we are not dealing with GBS, we are dealing with something else. So he was a case of spinal AV malformation, and we started him on methylprednisolone, and he later underwent neurosurgery to take care of the AV malformations. Okay, the next case. This one is a 9-year-old boy who presented to us on 15th of March. And earlier he had presented to us last year in the month of February with the complaints of pain abdomen, which lasted for about 3 days, severe pain, which used to disturb sleep. So 1st Feb, pain started. 3rd Feb, he developed weakness of the lower limbs. 4th Feb, he developed weakness of the upper limb. And this, in that first episode, he had not presented to us, but by 17th of Feb, he had recovered completely. He was admitted again on 12th of September, this time with pain abdomen again from 11th of September. There was hypotonia. There was weakness of, again, both the lower limbs, which ascended to the upper limbs over the period of 24 to 48 hours. Again, acute in onset. The onset was within 4 weeks. There was hypotonia and there was paralysis of the limbs. So the child fitted in the definition of acute flaccid paralysis. But the atypical feature over here was that the child was having recurrent episodes. And recurrent episodes with complete recovery. Of course, there was no prodrome suggestive of infection or immunization, but we don't get it in all the patients. So granted, possibly that's a weak point. But rapid recovery within a period of 2 weeks and occurrence of a second episode suggested that it is possibly not GBS, but it is something else. So we evaluated this patient because the patient was having his onset with pain abdomen. We evaluated for urine for porphobilinogen, which turned out to be positive. And this was a case of acute intermittent porphyria. Okay. The next case was a 10-year-old girl, slept in the night, slept well, but when she woke up in the morning around 5:30 to go to the school, she was not able to speak, not able to move any of the limbs. So the child slept off. When she slept off, she was perfectly fine. But when she woke up about 6 to 7 hours later, she had complete paralysis of all the 4 limbs, as well as involvement of the lower cranial nerves. On examination, she had shallow respiratory efforts, complete ophthalmoplegia. There was hypotonia. Power was grade 0 in all 4 limbs, and she had areflexia. Again, involvement of all the 4 limbs within 4 weeks, flaccidity of all the 4 limbs, paralysis. She fitted into the definition of acute flaccid paralysis. But the atypical feature over here was it was too rapid a progression. All the 4 limbs were involved, respiratory muscles were involved, cranial nerves were involved in a span of just 7 to 8 hours. So it was again possibly not GBS. And we did again a detailed examination and found there were fang marks which were present. So this was a case of snake envenomation, and all that she required was anti-snake venom, which took care of her problems. Okay, this was a case which troubled us a lot. So this was a 9-year-old girl. She presented to another center, not to our center again initially. There was weakness of both lower limbs, which started at around 10 in the morning. By 4 in the evening, she had weakness of the upper limbs also. And around midnight, she had developed respiratory paralysis. On examination, she had hypotonia, areflexia, power was grade 0. So again, acute flaccid paralysis, yes, fitted into the definition. And the center where she presented to correctly thought that possibly GBS is what she's having, gave IVIG. There was no response to IVIG. She continued to be on ventilator. So after a week period, she was given a second dose of IVIG. Again, no response, and she landed up with us. When she came to us, we found that she was having this kind of a rash all over the body. And the discharge document from the referring hospital said that this rash appeared after giving IVIG. So they thought that it's possibly related to IVIG. But when we looked at it carefully, there was involvement of palms and soles. There was involvement of mucosa. There was involvement of the facial skin, the buttocks, limbs, appendicular skin, everything was involved. We re-looked at the complete spectrum and looked at the POMR. So she had weakness of lower limbs, upper limbs, respiratory paralysis. And now she was having rash. She was possibly having sepsis, and she was having thrombocytopenia. Thankfully, during those periods, we were also dealing with another case of tick bite. So we were sampling another patient. We were sending a sample for rickettsial fever. So around that time, we sampled this kid also. We sent her sample also. The other case turned out to be negative, but rather this kid turned out to be positive. So this was a scenario in which tick bite can give rise to acute flaccid paralysis and can have a presentation absolutely similar to Guillain-Barré syndrome. And all that she required was management with doxycycline, and she completely improved thereafter. Okay, this was this was a case which we saw recently last month only. So a 4-year-old boy, second born of a 3rd-degree consanguineous marriage. The first child had expired following a brief episode of gastroenteritis, and the details were not available. The kid was in the village, had an episode of gastroenteritis, was taken to the local healthcare worker, and within 24, 36 hours, the kid had expired. So this kid was last year in March with fever, loose stools, and vomiting. And thereafter, on 3rd of April, he developed weakness of the lower limbs, followed by trunk, followed by upper limbs, and thereafter developed hyporeflexia and areflexia. So, and nerve conduction studies were done, which showed reduced CMAPs, normal velocities. We thought it's a Ullmann variant of GBS. We gave IVIG. The child recovered, and the child was discharged. But just before discharge, we started looking at his liver enzymes, and we found that ALT, AST were elevated. So we got a CPK also done around that time, and we found that his CPK was around 1400. Now, we had not got it done earlier, and no EMG was done. So we just thought that it was possibly not GBS. We made it look like GBS. We managed it like GBS. So we told the child to come back to us and follow up. Unfortunately, the child did not follow up with us, and thereafter kept on having these episodes of acute flaccid paralysis again and again. So first episode was the one in which he came to us in April 2019, which we managed as GBS. Thereafter, he had a second episode in May, recovered within 12 days. Third episode in October, again recovered within 7 days. Fourth episode in December. So this time, when this episode happened, he came back to us after complete recovery. About 7 to 10 days, when he was on the recovery path, he came back to us. And that time we got a CPK done, it was 1742. We also looked at the electrolytes, his potassium was 2. We thought maybe we are dealing with an inflammatory myositis. So we got ANA, CRP, all those things done, and everything else was negative. So now we were dealing with a kid who has been having recurrent episodes First episode managed as GBS, wrongly managed as GBS, and thereafter has been having recurrent such episodes with possibly high CPK, some hypokalemia, and all these episodes have been triggered by acute enteritis. And each time he's recovering within 7 to 10 days. Fifth episode occurred in January this year. Again, he came back to us after the episode with a CPK of 1620. Potassium was 1.9. We had already started him on pot chlor, but still potassium was low, and he had again recovered. He came back to us in February, again, episode of fever, loose stools, and vomiting. But this time when he came back to us, he was in anuria, he was in acute kidney injury. There was some history of passage of pigmented urine, hypertension, and he had started developing anasarca. On examination, he had acute flaccid paralysis. There was weakness of all 4 limbs. He could move a single limb at all. Areflexia, and investigation showed a CPK of 30,000 this time, with potassium of 5.2. Now this potassium of 5.2 is with a creatinine of 6.1. Just remember that. All other times his potassium has been on the lower side. Urine for myoglobin was positive. So we repeated, we just managed on the lines of acute kidney injury. We managed his IV fluids, ensured that the kidney injury doesn't worsen. And over the next few days or so, his CPK started dropping, his creatinine started improving. And over the next about 7 to 10 days, his CPK came down to 1,100. And by that time, his kidney functions had normalized and his potassium had dropped back to 1.9. Also along this time, by this time, his weakness had completely recovered, as it had happened in all other episodes. But he continued to have persistent hypertension. So there was hypokalemia, there was hypertension, and there was repeated episodes of acute flaccid paralysis which the child was having. So we looked up the literature, and there was, we found that there's something called as hypokalemia associated rhabdomyolysis, for which one of the primary investigation is to do plasma renin activity and low aldosterone activity. And we found that his plasma renin activity was low, along with low aldosterone activity. So this was a case of hypokalemia associated rhabdomyolysis with hypertension. Phenotypically, we thought it's a Liddle syndrome, but we have found it to be a channelopathy, which possibly is behaving like a Liddle syndrome. We're still working up this case. So what we want to tell you is that all cases of GBS are acute paralysis, but all cases of acute flaccid paralysis are not GBS. So this is the first fallacy that we commonly come across, that every case of AFP, we think that this is GBS and let's go ahead and give him IVIG. Yes, we should keep IVIG. You should keep an eye on IVIG, but we should keep on looking at the phenotypic features which are atypical. We'll come back to those atypical features a bit later again. So whenever we see a case of acute flaccid paralysis, these are the causes that we have to think of. We noted earlier that the low motor neuron is anterior horn cell, roots and nerves, neuromuscle junction, and muscles. I'll add another component to it, spinal cord. If a lesion in the spinal cord, then at a particular level, it's a UMN lesion. It's an LMN lesion, and everything below that is a UMN lesion. So at the level of spinal cord, we can have compressive lesions in the form of a trauma to the spine, an abscess, a hematoma. It can be a transverse myelitis, an inflammatory lesion of the spinal cord. At the level of anterior horn cell, we see less and less of, we don't see polio actually, and hopefully we'll never see polio. But what we do end up seeing is vaccine-associated poliomyelitis and polio-like viruses, which are commonly enteroviral, which commonly lead to enteroviral illnesses. And Japanese encephalitis is a common reason which can lead to involvement of the anterior horn cell. Rarely we may come across a vascular infarction involving the anterior horn cells. Thereafter, in the roots and nerves, the injury may be immune-mediated because of GBS. It may be a toxin-mediated injury in the form of diphtheria, porphyria, or arsenic. Rabies can directly lead to damage of the roots and nerves. And still to date, we continue to see traumatic neuritis, most commonly involving the sciatic nerves because of a deep intramuscular injection which has been given all the way close to the sciatic notch. At the level of neuromuscular junction, we can have myasthenia gravis presenting for the first time with myasthenic crisis, but what we see more commonly are snake bite and organophosphorus poisonings. Botulism we see less and less nowadays, but snake bite and OP poisoning is what we continue to see quite frequently. At the level of muscle, it can be myositis, which is one of the common DDs, which is commonly seen. It keeps on occurring again and again, possibly polymyositis, or even for the first time, it can be the first episode of polymyositis which the child is having. It can be hypokalemic periodic paralysis. In the last case that I presented, hypokalemic periodic paralysis was one of our DDs. What went against was that the child was having a very high CPK. So the child was having rhabdomyolysis, as a result of which the child was having this. So whenever we see such a scenario, we have to go through the complete history and examination. And these are some of the salient points. The list is not complete, but I just try to highlight some of the things. So if there is a fever at the onset of the weakness, then it is possibly not GBS. It is possibly an infectious etiology which is causing it. So polio or a polio-like virus is causing it, or transverse myelitis, myositis, or an inflammatory abscess within the spinal cord is what is possibly causing the weakness. History of trauma leading to spinal cord compression. History of exposure. By exposure, we mean exposure to toxins, exposure to snake bite. That is, if the child has been to the fields or to the farms, or if there's been a dog bite in the past. Any preceding infectious illness or history of vaccination in the recent past, up to 12 weeks. So that can be suggestive of Guillain-Barré syndrome or even transverse myelitis. And for infectious illness, we directly ask for any bull neck, any fever, any sore throat which the child has had, which can lead to the possibility of a post-diphtheritic polyneuropathy. Constipation in less than 1 year can give a clue towards botulism. Early bowel and bladder involvement. By early, we mean that if bowel and bladder involvement is present right at the beginning, the moment the child feels weakness of the limbs, he has onset of the bowel and bladder involvement, it is more likely to be, one should rule out a compressive myelopathy or transverse myelitis, though it can occur in GBS also, but the first DD should be to rule out a spinal cord lesion than a GBS if the bowel and bladder involvement is present right at the beginning. History suggestive of any factor in the form of diarrhea, such as in hypokalemia or in intraviral myelitis. If the weakness is occurring after exercise or after a large meal, again goes in favor of hypokalemic periodic paralysis. Or if there's a history of intramuscular injection, then one should think of traumatic sciatic neuritis, and even polio can get precipitated because of an iron injection. Clinically, then we look at whether the weakness was ascending or descending. Ascending weakness usually associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome, but can also be seen with rabies or varicella zoster. But if we see ascending paralysis, the first thing that we think of is that it's most likely to be Guillain-Barré syndrome. A descending weakness is more characteristic of diphtheria or botulism. Palpate the muscles. If the muscles are tender, we are dealing with an inflammatory lesion, which may be an infectious inflammation or a non-infectious inflammation. Infectious inflammation is myositis, viral myositis, or it can be an inflammatory myopathy. Now, right at the beginning, we said that sensory symptoms are also seen in Guillain-Barré syndrome. So some amount of pain might be complained by the patients of Guillain-Barré syndrome, but they usually end up having paresthesias rather than tenderness of the muscles. Reflexes are absent with Guillain-Barré, with polio, with diphtheria. Even in a transverse myelitis in the initial stages of spinal shock, the reflexes may be absent. Reflexes are usually preserved with the periodic paralysis, with myasthenia gravis, and with botulism, basically the neuromuscular junction involvement, and they are exaggerated below the level of spinal lesion. So if we are thinking of a transverse myelitis or a compressive myelopathy, the reflexes will be absent at the level of the lesion, and below the level of the lesion, the reflexes will be exaggerated. Because it's a low motor neuron lesion at the level of the spinal cord, where the compression is taking place, and everything below that is a UMN lesion. Look for a sensory level. At times it is difficult in small kids, but if a sensory level is present and it points straight away towards a spinal cord lesion, either a compressive or an inflammatory lesion. Prominent autonomic symptoms in the form of tachycardia, hypotension, go more in favor of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Examine the spine, look for any spinal tenderness, for any trauma or epidural abscess. But again, if there is a definite history of spinal trauma, we don't go in for a spinal cord movement assessment or look for any point tenderness on spinal cord. We straight away go in for an MRI of the spine. And check for neck stiffness, which can be present with polio, with myelitis, with transverse myelitis or intraviral myelitis, and with Guillain-Barré syndrome. So these were mainly the clinical clues which can take us to the diagnosis of the various differential diagnoses of acute flaccid paralysis. The second fallacy that we commonly face is that acute flaccid and that GBS is a homogeneous syndrome. We usually end up stopping at the diagnosis of GBS, which is slightly wrong, because GBS in itself consists of, it's a syndrome. It has got several components to it. What we usually are interested in is that, is it a demyelinating neuropathy or is it an axonal neuropathy? Now, demyelination is, now every nerve has a myelin sheath on top of it, and within the myelin sheath is the axon. So is it the myelin which has got damaged, or is it the one which has got damaged? Now, this has got implications not for the treatment, but it has got implications for prognosticating the parents, how much is the child going to recover and how fast or how slow the recovery is going to be. Now, with a demyelinating lesion, the chances of recovery are much more as compared to the axonal variants, in which if the axon has got damaged, the chances are the recovery is not going to be much. It's going to be minimal, if at all. But with myelin, yes, neuromyelin may get laid down, and the transmission of impulses may recover to a great extent. So it is important to recognize that there are several subtypes of Guillain-Barré syndrome, and to classify into it, and to classify, what we need is a nerve conduction study in order to say that whether it's a demyelinating or it's an axonal form. And again, axonal form is more commonly associated with Campylobacter. Inflammatory is more commonly associated with the viruses. In the West, it is mainly CMV and Epstein-Barr virus. We see a lot of ADs following influenza. What we are interested in is that the recovery is minimal, or recovery is less with the Aman variant, whereas it usually is uniform and it takes place in majority of the patients with AIDP. Whereas with Aman variant, it is, they describe two patterns, rapid and slow. Rapid is if the treatment is initiated very early, within 7 days of the onset, and otherwise it's a slow recovery and an incomplete recovery. So the management option stays the same, but the prognosis changes whether it's an AIDP or an Aman variant. So, and whenever we are ordering nerve conduction studies in GBS, we have to specify that we need nerve conduction in 4 or more motor nerves, at least 3 sensory nerves, and we need a F-wave assessment and H-reflex assessment. Now, these are important because F-wave and H-reflex may get affected much earlier in the course of the disease, before the motor nerve or the sensory nerve actual involvement shows up. So assessment of F-wave and H-reflex is mandatory, and it has to be asked for by the clinician. Only then it will be done. So coming back to the first case that we had, 10 years boy who came back and was found to have hypotonia, areflexia, and reduced power. Excuse me. So we thought that he has GBS. We started IVIG. We did a nerve conduction studies, and we found that there were no CMAPs, and there was, so since there was no recording which was available in nerve conduction studies, we said that it's possibly an uncharacterizable nerve conduction, and we don't know whether to call it a demyelinating type or an axonal type. So we started managing him with IVIG. Now, again, we did not do CSF so far for this child. The third fallacy which we commonly face is that let's get a CSF. The moment the child presents, let's do a CSF and to diagnose GBS. Now, nerve conduction studies in CSF are not required for the diagnosis of GBS. If in doubt, do a nerve conduction studies, but GBS is usually a clinical diagnosis and we require nerve conduction studies to classify what type of GBS it is. And CSF is again a supportive investigation. And repeated studies have shown that CSF is usually normal in the first week and the classical albuminocytological dissociation starts appearing only around 10th day, between 7th to 10th day of the illness, and peaks around 14th day. So a normal protein level does not make the diagnosis of GBS unlikely or even exclude the diagnosis of GBS. So again, to reiterate, do not wait for CSF or do not wait for NCS to start treating GBS. If you think it is GBS, if there are no atypical features, and if you think it is GBS, it is better to start IVIG. But if there are atypical features, keep on going back to the child, keep on looking at atypical features. That can be something else. The fourth fallacy is that we usually end our discussion is that recovery is mediated by repair, that everything is going to get repaired, and that is why recovery is taking place. Now, GBS is an inflammatory disease. So there is inflammation which starts damaging the axons or starts damaging the myelin. So if it's damaging the myelin, it will lead to demyelination. If it persists or if it is damaging the axons, it will lead to axonopathy. Now, the moment the demyelination has taken place or the axonopathy has taken place, the recovery usually is incomplete. The recovery is the best if we are able to address it at the level of inflammation. So that is why we usually say the moment you think GBS, think of starting IVIG, and the IVIG should be started as early as possible because we want to minimize inflammation which the child is having. So the recovery is mediated by reversal of inflammation. It is only partially reversible if the demyelination has taken place, and marginally, by marginally we mean it's a very minimal reversal which takes place if axonopathy has already taken place. That is why there's an urgency to address the inflammation right at the beginning. And how do we address this inflammation? The two main treatments are IVIG and plasmapheresis. What IVIG does is that it binds to the anti-ganglioside antibodies, it inhibits the complement activation, and it inhibits the FC-mediated activation of the immune cells. Three things are inhibited, as a result of which IVIG is able to suppress ongoing inflammation and prevent ongoing damage of the myelin or of the axons. The dose that we give is 2 grams per kg. The schedule is 0.5 grams per kg over 5 days or 1 gram per kg over 2 days. And alternative is plasmapheresis. We give 5 exchanges on alternate days. And what plasmapheresis does is it removes the antibodies. So IVIG was neutralizing the antibody. This is removing the antibody and the complement factors. So again, by both these mechanisms, the damage, the ongoing damage to the nerves or to the axons or to the myelin is reduced, as a result of which the recovery is mediated. As we said, recovery is mediated by preventing or by reducing inflammation. Rest everything is part of rehabilitation. Now, a common question again which figures up is, should we give IVIG or should we give plasmapheresis? If you have both the things, then what Cochrane has shown is that both the things are equally effective. And what they say is that there was significant improvement with IVIG than with supportive treatment alone. So IVIG was effective, definitely effective. Then over here it shows that it doesn't matter whether you give IVIG over 2 days or over 5 days. So IVIG should be given, whether over 2 days or over 5 days, it doesn't matter as far as recovery of the child is concerned. At our center, we usually end up giving it over 5 days because it reduces the side effects which these children have. And IVIG started within 2 weeks from the onset, hastens recovery as much as plasma exchange. So the Message is that IVIG is as good as plasmapheresis. Therapy over 2 days is as good as over 5 days. But either ways, IVIG or plasmapheresis should be given to these children. So there's no difference between plasma exchange and IVIG. No benefit of combining the plasma exchange with IVIG. And there's no role of steroids, mycophenolate, brain-derived natriuretic factor, or other anti-inflammatory agents. Eculizumab is another drug which is under investigation. It's a hell of an expensive drug. We don't know what its outcome is going to be. But as far as the current recommendation goes, we start with IVIG and we give it over 5 days rather than over 2 days, mainly because of the side effects. Otherwise, 2 days is as good as 5 days, and IVIG is as good as plasma exchange. Apart from this, apart from IVIG or plasma exchange, the supportive treatment in the form of bed sores, bowel care, bladder care, nutrition, ventilation, physiotherapy has to be carried on. We have to keep on checking for the vital parameters, for hypotension, for tachycardia, for lung capacity. If you have a spirometry available on the bedside, it's well and good. Otherwise, what we usually do is we ask the children to do the single breath count. And if the single breath count is deteriorating rapidly, then it shows involvement of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. And that indicates that possibly this kid may end up requiring ventilation. A common question that we end up asking is that if you're allowed to do one investigation in a case of acute flaccid paralysis or GBS, what would it be? And the answer that we expect is that the single investigation which we want is a blood gas. Because if the child is having carbon dioxide retention, then it means that he'll require a respiratory support, he'll require ventilation in some form. And so the single investigation, which is most important, is not nerve conduction or CSF. It is a blood gas analysis, which will tell us that whether or not the child is having respiratory weakness or respiratory insufficiency or not. Mortality rates are usually low, and if at all they are there because of respiratory failure, arrhythmia. Respiratory failure is seen less and less common nowadays. We are able to support respiration for these kids for months and months. We have a kid in our center who's on ventilator support since July or so, and he continues to be on that. Despite the best of the treatment, 1 out of 5 children will not be able to walk. And those who are likely to walk will start walking 6 months from onset. So, and usually these 20% are those who get a delayed IVIG or who get a delayed immunosuppressive therapy. And the maximum improvement takes place in the first 6 months, and some amount of improvement may carry on up to 1 year after the onset of illness, but thereafter the improvement is hardly any. And the rehabilitation has to carry on with physiotherapy, with acute flaccid paralysis, and something which we often forget, as the case which we showed, the 10-year-old boy. Now, this was a 10-year-old boy who suddenly stopped walking. So it's a big psychological trauma for this kid as well as for the family. So psychological support is something which is needed for these kids. This is just to highlight the proforma that we use. I don't think we end up filling all of this, but this is something which we expect that we should be filling. So apart from the usual things, we usually like to comment on whether or not we are able to localize, whether or not we have a sensory level. If NCS was done, what was the report? If imaging has been done, MRI of the spine or anything, what is the retro status, which can be associated at times with it? Any B12 folate deficiency if it has been investigated, any screening for tick if it has been done, heavy metal screening for lead, porphobilinogen. If the child has been on ventilation, then what was the mode? IVIG. Gabapentin is something which is given for paresthesias and pain which these children have. So if it has been started or not, and the vital monitoring for postural hypertension, respiratory status, and other things, cranial nerve deficits. So this is like done on a daily basis. Every day we keep on looking in it, and at times within the same day we keep on looking every 12 hourly. So this is a chart which can help us decipher a lot of things on day-to-day basis, even if we are not dealing with GPS or something which is mimicking GPS. So this is an algorithm, again, not a complete one, but this is the best that I could find. This appeared in Indian Journal of Pediatrics, I think about 8-9 years back, but it is still as good. So the first thing that you do is you look for a sensory level. At times difficult in kids, but it's worthwhile doing a sensory examination, looking at a sensory level. Check if there's bowel and bladder abnormality. Did the first thing which happened to the child was bowel and bladder abnormality? Is there a local spinal tenderness which the child is having? If the answer is yes, then the first thing that we get done is get an MRI spine done. Look if there is a spinal cord compression present or not, or if there is a hyperintensity at any particular level of the spine suggestive of transverse myelitis. Because if this is the lesion, then he's possibly requires an altogether different kind of management. This will require a surgery, and this will require high-dose steroids. If the answer is no to this, then look at the reflexes. Is it complete reflexia? Is there hyperreflexia, normal reflexia, or is there hyperreflexia? So if there is reflexia, then it is possibly a GBS, a polio-like virus illness. It can still be transverse myelitis presenting early on with a spinal shock kind of a condition, snake bite, tick paralysis, or a traumatic neuritis. Traumatic neuritis is usually localized to one odd limb. It will not involve all the 4 limbs. So this entity is usually easy to recognize. If the child is having hyporeflexia or a normal reflexia, we're dealing with something to do with muscles or to do with neuromuscle junction. And early on in the course, GBS can have normal reflexes. So we, as we said in the chart, we keep on going back every 6 to 8 hourly whenever we have a doubt. And if the child has hyperreflexia, then the child definitely has transverse myelitis. Look for a sensory level. Look for the level of low motor neuron lesion at which he will be having loss of reflexes. So to conclude, always as an exercise, go through the complete neuraxis. Upper motor neuron versus low motor neuron, always decide it early on. And if it is low motor neuron, try to decide which anatomical component is involved. Keep on checking the power of muscles. We often forget the respiratory muscles. Check for the intercostals, check for diaphragm. But these are the ones which are going to decide whether he requires ventilation or not. Think of GBS, but don't delay IVIG. Just that you don't have CSF or just that you don't have nerve conduction studies. And this is just to sum up the features which should raise doubt about the diagnosis of GBS. If you end up doing CSF and CSF shows more than 50 cells, if there's pulmonary dysfunction, but there is no limb weakness at the onset. So the child comes with respiratory paralysis, but the limbs are near normal, or the limb weakness is out of proportion better than the pulmonary dysfunction. If there are severe sensory signs right at the beginning, it points more towards a spinal cord lesion than anything else. If there's bowel and bladder dysfunction at the onset, I keep on repeating this again and again, and I keep on committing mistakes myself also in this regard. If there is bowel and bladder weakness right at the beginning, think of spinal cord before you think of GBS. If there's fever at the time of onset of the weakness, excuse me, then it is more likely to be an infectious or an inflammatory disease involving the spinal cord or the anterior horn cell or the muscle rather than a GBS. A spinal cord sensory level definitely points to a spinal cord lesion. A slow progressive lesion with limited weakness without respiratory involvement. So the lesion has been going on for 2 or 3 weeks. There's no respiratory involvement. It is unlikely to be a case of GBS. If there's persistent erythrometry of weakness, you found erythrometry of weakness, you come back after 6 to 8 hours, the erythrometry is persisting. Possibly it is not GBS. And if there's bowel and bladder dysfunction, you thought that it is possibly because of autonomic dysfunction in the case of GBS. But when you go back and look at it again after 24 hours, the bowel bladder dysfunction persists. Again, start thinking of alternative diagnosis. Okay, I'll end up with this interesting case who had us.
Thank you, Dr. Vishal. Dr. Vishal,
I'll just finish off with this case quickly. 2 minutes.
There are actually around 60 questions to answer. sir, please.
Yeah, I'll go through them. I'll just quickly finish this. So just to drive home a point. So this was a 12 years boy who had a brief febrile episode around mid of March. The febrile episode was managed by the local physician, and he came to us just about 10 days back with inability to bear weight on the lower limbs and decreased spontaneous movement of the lower limbs since 2nd of April. On examination, his high mental functions, cranial nerves, everything was normal. Bulk was normal. Tone was normal to decrease. We were not able to decipher what kind of tone is it. Power was reduced in the lower limbs, but not severely reduced, while it was near normal in the upper limbs. Reflexes were elicitable and abdominal reflexes were absent, and he was able to walk with support. And he was referred to us as a case of GBS. And this is how he was walking when he came to us. And the first thing which occurred to us was, despite so much of weakness, he's not falling. Okay, so whatever happens, he never used to fall down and hurt himself. And then we stealthily tried to make another video for him. And in the meantime, we got a NCS done, which was normal. He had already got his CSF done. He had got his MRI in brain and spine done. Everything was normal. The nerve conduction studies with us were normal. And we looked at his other video, in which, look at the normal way in which he was walking. So this was a child who possibly had a stressful event, following which he was having this kind of an episode where he was making it look like acute flaccid paralysis, while he did not have any of the weaknesses. So this is the other end of the spectrum which we may end up seeing. And finally, to conclude, always end up seeing the patient in totality. There might be clues hidden away from the neurological examination, which may end up giving you the diagnosis. With this, I end, and I will start taking on the questions. Am I permitted to take questions?
Thank you. Of course, Dr. Vishal, thank you very much. It was a very elaborate, very good. Please try to answer as many questions as possible of the student. A quick look, you have 10 minutes.
Yeah, so I'll start with what is the role of MRI for the diagnosis of GBS. Role of MRI is we don't get MRI done for diagnosis of GBS. But if MRI is being ordered for anything else and we think it can be GBS, then we usually ask a contrast study, and there will be contrast enhancement of the nerve roots, which will be evident on MRI of the spine. Should not be done for diagnosis of GBS. GBS is finally a clinical diagnosis. There's another question which is related to this. Hello. Hello.
We can hear you, Dr. Vishal.
Okay.
Please continue.
Okay. The other question was how to differentiate Lyme's disease from Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now, Lyme's is again a differential diagnosis, but it usually has some amount of myelitis possibly along with it. So we need an MRI of the spine, and we need CSF analysis done for diagnosis of Lyme's disease. The treatment is totally different. You require ceftriaxone for treatment of Lyme. The other question is, how is IVIG given? Now, IVIG is usually given as an infusion. The dose, what we use is 400 mg per kg per day for 5 days. And we started at an infusion at a slightly lower rate, let's say at a 10 ml per hour. If the child tolerates it, then we increase it to 15 ml per hour. If the child tolerates it, we increase it to 20 ml per hour and let it go till the end of infusion. So IVIG prescription will be 400 milligram per kg given, 400 milligram per kg per day given as 10 ml per hour for 1 hour, followed by 15 ml per hour for 1 hour, followed by 20 ml per hour till the end of infusion. And this thing has to be carried on till the complete 2 gram per kg has gone. How to differentiate it from ADEM? This is another question. Now, ADEM is a totally different entity. ADEM is demyelination occurring in CNS. The terminology itself is self-explanatory, that is acute demyelinating encephalomyelitis. So there's encephalopathy which will always take place. So the child will have altered sensorium. So it's a completely different entity. And possibly there'll be a talk on this. Then there is another question. Do we require IVIG or plasmapheresis in every case of GBS? Yes, every case of GBS requires an anti-inflammatory therapy. Now, this anti-inflammatory therapy can be in the form of IVIG or can be in the form of plasmapheresis. And both are equally effective. We usually start with IVIG because it's less invasive for the child. And what is the best investigation for diagnosis? If there's a doubt, the investigation which you should do is nerve conduction studies. And early on, when you're ordering nerve conduction study, the investigation should specify that do a H reflex and do a F wave, both, for diagnosis of GBS. Because quite early in the course of GBS, if you have a doubt, then the motor nerve conduction studies can be normal unless and until you have ordered H reflex and F wave along with that. I think I've covered most of the questions through the course of my presentation. Okay, there was one question, why does nerve involvement have ascending pattern? Now, this is interesting because it is the longest nerves which get affected first. So the longest nerves are the ones which go to the lower limbs. So that is why it is the longest nerves which get affected first, and thereafter the nerves which have got shorter lengths keep on getting affected. So that's why it starts from the lower limb and keeps on going upwards to the nerves which have the shorter length. Okay, I think I've covered most of the questions. Rest of the questions were covered in the course of the talk. Anything else?
Do you want to answer a few more, Dr. Vishal? There are many more. You have another 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm looking at them.
Please answer the clinical questions which they have asked.
Okay. Clinical. Can people keep on posting the questions again, because there are so many of them? I'm finding it difficult to.
You can scroll down, Dr. Vishal.
Okay, the question is, why is the weakness symmetrical? Because the weakness is it's a more of a systemic illness. There are autoantibodies which are present, which lead to this kind of weakness. So that's why. Proximal weakness occurs in GBS. Yes, GBS can start off as a proximal weakness and thereafter can have both proximal as well as the distal weakness. The reason is again because it is the longest nerves which are getting affected. So the proximal weakness can precede the distal weakness at times. And in transverse myelitis, when do we get areflexia and hyperreflexia? Now in transverse myelitis, areflexia takes place at the level of the lesion. Now transverse myelitis means that there's a particular level of the spinal cord which has got completely cut off. Let's say if the lesion is at the level of L2, L3. So that means that at the level of L2, L3, the spinal cord has got completely damaged. So the part of the reflexes which is mediated by L2, L3, that is the knee jerk, will be absent. But the ankle jerk may get brisk, because for ankle jerk, the lesion has taken place at L2 level. So it becomes an upper motor neuron for the ankle jerk, while it's a low motor neuron for the knee jerk. Let's say the lesion has taken place at the level of C5-6. So the biceps might be absent, while the knee jerk, ankle jerk, everything would end up getting brisk. So in transverse myelitis, the reflexes are absent at the level of the low motor neuron lesion, or at the level where the lesion occurs, and everything below that is it gets involved. Bowel and bladder involvement in GBS. Yes, bowel and bladder commonly gets involved in GBS. It may not be the first presentation, but usually in the first 24 hours, they do end up getting bowel and bladder involvement in the form of urinary retention, which usually can last for up to 72 hours, at times up to 3 or 4 days. but it usually starts starts improving by about third or fourth day of the illness. Is there mortality in GBS? Mortality in GBS is usually related to respiratory failure. Otherwise, if we are supporting the respiration, I don't think we should lose a child of GBS.
Many students have asked the role of methylprednisolone.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. If we don't give IVIG, is methylprednisolone alone is useful? No, methylprednisolone doesn't work. Now, prednisolone is a lymphocytic agent. Okay, so if we understand the pathophysiology of GBS, now GBS is that an immune phenomena has taken place in the body, either in the form of an infection or in the form of vaccination, as a result of which lymphocytes have got activated. They have produced autoantibodies, and those autoantibodies are what are causing the damage. Now, even if you give methylprednisolone, which are going to cause lysis of those lymphocytes, still those antibodies which are present, they'll keep on causing damage. So it is not going to help that child. The lympholysis is going to take place, but the autoantibodies which are formed are going to cause persistent damage. So you have to either neutralize those antibodies or you have to remove those antibodies from the circulation. Now, for neutralizing the antibodies, you need IVIG, and for removal of antibodies, you need plasmapheresis. What methylprednisolone is going to do is it's going to cause lysis of the lymphocytes, and it is going to prevent formation of more antibodies, but it's not going to help with the antibodies which have already got formed. So that's why methylprednisolone is not useful. Plasmapheresis and methylprednisolone combination in transverse myelitis. Is it more beneficial than either of them alone? Now, we didn't cover transverse myelitis in full detail, but usually we start with methylprednisolone alone. We end up giving plasmapheresis usually if it's NMO spectrum kind of a transverse myelitis, which is involving multiple spinal segments. In those cases, yes, plasmapheresis is highly effective, but usually the first line therapy for transverse myelitis is methylprednisolone. And if there's no response, we end up adding plasmapheresis to it. What is the role of repeat dose of IVIG? Repeat dose of IVIG, usually if we start looking at the trials, then there are not many trials which recommend or which say it is not effective. So there's not much literature to support or to refute its use. But we usually end up giving the second dose of IVIG after 7 days. And the clinical criteria are if there is persistence of progression of the illness, that is, we gave IVIG, we have finished IVIG over 5 days, and after 48 hours, we see that the Guillain-Barré syndrome or the weakness has further progressed. It was limited till the upper limb, and now even the diaphragm has got involved. So in those cases, we repeat a dose of IVIG. The second scenario where we repeat the persistent weakness and there's no improvement at all. In those scenarios, we definitely end up giving a second dose of IVIG. What else? Kaushik, help me out with the questions. Any more questions which I'm missing out? Okay, somebody.
Do you want to quickly comment on gabapentin? Many people have asked pain.
Yeah, pain is usually a phenomena which occurs at two main time points. One is right at the beginning of the GBS, when the inflammation is at its peak and it is causing neuropathy. And second is when the recovery is taking place. That is the time the new nerve shoots are emerging, and that is the time these paresthesias and pain start appearing. So usually what we do is we initially start with paracetamol, and honestly, paracetamol doesn't affect much. It may cause reduction by 10 to 15%. And thereafter we go on to gabapentin, and we continue these children on gabapentin for the next 4 to 6 weeks. At times we have even given it for 3 months. And gabapentin usually helps in neuropathic kind of a pain. So so those 6 to 12 weeks is the time when the nerve recovery is taking place. So that's how gabapentin helps.
What is the role of plasmapheresis? Plasmapheresis. Suppose they are trying to ask that if IVIG has not worked,
okay,
do
yes.
you recommend plasmapheresis?
yes, as the last resort, we do end up going for plasmapheresis. Okay, the typical protocol is, let's say we have a child with diagnosis GBS. He comes to us today, and we start him on IVIG. You can give it over 2 days, you can give it over 5 days, and we give it, let's say we give it over 2 days, and after 48, 72 hours, we see there's no improvement. We give a second dose of IVIG. Again, 72 hours, there's further progression, or there's complete lack of improvement. Then yes, there's no role of third dose of IVIG. You take him up for plasmapheresis in that case. We don't know how much it will benefit, but yes, whatever benefit that can take place will take place. It will not take place with the third dose of IVIG. We will have to go in for plasmapheresis.
A quick comment versus AIDP with their prognosis.
Okay, CIDP I did not cover because we were dealing mainly with the acute thing. But if
AIDP versus
Kaushik, I can't hear you.
It is AP versus Aman.
AIDP versus Aman. Okay, AIDP versus Aman is, again, I think I rushed through it. So AIDP is when the myelin sheath on top of the nerve gets damaged. So it's like electric wire, the copper wire on top of which we have the insulation. So if the insulation gets damaged, that is what AIDP is. The copper wire in the center is intact. And gradually over time, the bodies with all the Schwann cells will be able to generate some amount of myelin. May not be 100%, but it will be able to generate some amount of myelin, and that insulation will reappear. Now imagine a scenario in which the copper wire within the insulation gets damaged. So it's very difficult for the body to generate that copper wire again. So that's why the recovery in Aman is less and it is incomplete. Whereas with AIDP, the chances of recovery are more. Again, within AIDP, the chances of recovery are more if we give IVIG early on. That is, when the inflammation is at its peak, if we give IVIG at that point of time in the initial 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, that is the time, the chances are that the damage to the myelin sheath will be least and we'll be able to revert back to the normal myelin much earlier. While if we give it after 7 or 10 days, then the chances are a lot of myelin has got damaged and the reversal will be less and less. So AIDP,
a quick answer on how long does this, a quick answer on how long spinal shock stage last?
Spinal shock stage, it can last for up to 7 to 10 days at times, but usually we start it. We start seeing it. If you ask us about the median time, then the spinal shock should start reversing between 5th to 7th day, but it can last for up to 10 days.
Thank you, Dr.